Okay, thank you for joining me. My name is Professor Geoff Beattie. I'm Professor of Psychology at Edge Hill University, and I'm going to be talking about body language. I've studied body language for quite a few years. I did my PhD at Cambridge studying social interaction between people and became fascinated by the complexity of how people interact. Now, I've written quite a few books about this. One of my most recent is called Rethinking Body Language, and it's called Rethinking Body Language for a very good reason. I would argue that most of what we think we know about body language is actually incorrect. It's based on a number of assumptions, which is body language is quite slow and easy to recognize, and you see the same things repeated again and again. But of course, what's really interesting when you start looking at human beings is how dynamic they are. And also how much of our non-verbal communication connects to what we're saying. And what's really interesting about body language books, most of them, is that the two systems seem to be completely separate. But all you have to do is watch a human being for a few seconds, and even watch me now, and you see that much of what we do is kind of connected to what we're saying. So there's that intimate connection. Now, another feature about body language is it's really used in the real world is it's often very quick, very dynamic. People don't necessarily want other people to read their emotions. They try to cover them. They use masks of various kinds. So if you want to read people accurately, you have to learn to identify masks when they're used. Now, of course, the commonest mask that human beings use in everyday life is a smile. And the smile is really easy to put on the face to cover our emotional state. So if you want to read people accurately, you have to learn to identify masking smiles, differentiate them from real smiles, and then try to decode the emotion underneath as the smile starts to fade. And this is all a little bit more complicated than many body language books would have us believe. Just by way of interest, if you want to identify a masking smile, the easiest thing to look out for is the way it goes onto the face and off the face. Masking smiles fade very quickly. Genuine smiles fade much more slowly. And that's a real telltale sign. So you're looking for the emotion just underneath. So what I'm arguing is that much of what people read when they read body language books is kind of true. It's based on something, but it's not the full picture because so much of body language in real life is quick, dynamic. People are trying to cover their emotions and you're having to read beneath the signals they're sending, and that's all a little bit more complicated than many people would have you believe. And I did a book a couple of years ago called Get the Edge, How Simple Changes Will Transform Your Life, which explored how people can use this knowledge in their everyday life. So it's a slightly different take on body language, and one of the things I'm particularly interested in terms of how revealing they are hand movements. Now, the point about hand movements is not just that I use them a lot, everybody uses them a lot. And there are some people who say, well, I never gesture, I never move my hands when I'm talking, but just watch them in conversation when they're interrupted. As soon as people are interrupted in talk, the hands fly out of the pockets and they start doing these complex images in the air in front of people. Now, psychologists for a long while thought, what's the point of those? Are they just kind of evolutionary relics? You know, we started off gesturing and we ended up speaking and we still gesture, but there's no real point to it. Some psychologists said, well, what they do is they help you find words when you talk. It's an extraordinary gift being able to find words so quickly as we speak, accessing the mental lexicon. But the theory that psychologists accept these days is that what these hand movements do is capture a core bit of the underlying representation. And a really simple example from a guy called David McNeil in the University of Chicago is that someone's talking about someone being chased with an umbrella. And the person says in speech, and she chases them out again. And the hand does a gestural movement. Now, what's really interesting is the person doesn't say the speech and then do the gestural movement. Rather, the hands get into position to make the gestural movement simultaneously with the speech. So before you're consciously aware of what you're going to say, you're doing the gestural accompaniment. Now, that's very interesting. And what's also very interesting is that we don't have a dictionary for these gestural movements. And it looks as if in everyday life, human beings create meaning for other human beings through these gestures they make. You can say to someone, if someone uses a word you don't understand, I don't understand that word, but you can't say, I didn't understand that gestural movement. So they become really interesting. And really interesting because we're not consciously aware of what we're doing with our hand movements. Now, I know that I'm doing something with my hands at the moment, but if you asked me to repeat exactly what I'm doing, I couldn't repeat it. Which makes them potentially very revealing about psychological state. Because if we are using the hands to communicate aspects of our underlying thinking, and we're careful about what we say, then it might mean that these gestures become a better indicator of our true underlying thoughts. Now you can see the kind of implications of this. Now there's a couple of interesting facts here. One interesting fact is when people are consciously trying to tell lies, deceive, one of the things they do is they inhibit their hand movements. Now the inhibition of hand movements is one of the best indicators that people are lying. It's really interesting if you ask people about how you can tell if someone's lying. They always go for the same kind of things. They say, look at the face, look at the eyes are the gateway to the soul. But people know that their face is going to be monitored. And they confuse people by controlling their facial expression. Now what's interesting when it comes to hand movements is the control mechanism here is quite simple. You just have to try and lock the hands or sit on your hands or move less. People often think people move more when they're deceiving. They're fidgety, they're more nervous. But generally speaking, the academic research suggests that people move much less. Now what's also really interesting is if people do not inhibit their hand movements, then the hands become even more revealing about psychological state. Now, I've done a lot of research in the past few years into what are called gesture-speech mismatches. And gesture-speech mismatches are where someone's saying something and the accompanying movement doesn't seem to correspond to what's being said. So to give you a simple example, what's really interesting if people talk about relationships, say, they often use the hands to indicate themselves and their partner. And they use the gestural space in a meaningful way. So if you're feeling very close to your partner, you will go myself and my partner. Slightly less close, myself and my partner. Less close still, myself and my partner. And if it's really not good, it's myself and my partner. I've done some research on how people use this gestural space to talk about relationships, and it's really interesting. The hands kind of pick up on this aspect of the relationship. Now, of course, I'm trying to talk about non-verbal communication. I'm very aware that I've got no stimuli to show you, and I should mention at this point that part of the reason I'm doing this talk today, my first ever talk for Psychologies Facebook Live, is that I'm doing a talk in London on body language this coming Tuesday, and Psychologies are helping promote this talk. It's in Shoreditch at BBB. It's being, as I say, promoted by Psychologies magazine, and it's Tuesday, 1st of May from 7 to 9 p.m. So if you want to see some really interesting examples of this and how body language may reveal true underlying state, then I would urge you to attend. I should also say that as well as being an academic, I've done quite a lot of media work, and the reason I mention that here is that I worked on Big Brother, the whole duration it was on Channel 4 from 2000 to 2011. And from my point of view, Big Brother was a phenomenal experience in the sense that it gave me an enormous corpus of material to analyse. And of course, I was the on-screen psychologist. But what's really interesting, if you come to the talk, you'll see lots of examples from Big Brother where I will show you examples of what people are saying. And when you watch the non-verbal communication, the dynamic, quick non-verbal communication, you will see on occasion where it just doesn't match what they're saying. And of course, you then get the opportunity in Big Brother, or I got the opportunity to ask people about what they thought about people and the other contestants, and it just gives you this little bit of psychological insights. I might also mention before I forget at this point that if anyone's interested in the academic research, they should go to geoffbeattie.com and you'll see examples of the academic research that I publish and a lot of the books that I've done as well. When it comes to deception as well, there are other much more interesting and subtle measures of deception when it comes to these gestural movements. So if people don't inhibit their gestural movements, what other telltale signs are there? Well, one of the most interesting I found in the research I did was that when people make a gestural movement, the gesture starts before they get to the speech they're going to be talking about. So the gesture starts unconsciously pretty early on. And there's something called a preparation phase when the hand gets into position to make the movement. And then there's something sometimes called a pre-stroke hold, which is a temporary pause before they make the meaningful bit of the gesture, which is called the stroke phase. Now what's really interesting after that, there's something called a post-stroke hold, again temporary hold, and then a retraction phase where the hand goes back to the rest position. When people are deceiving, some really interesting changes to those phases of a gesture, in that the stroke phase, the meaningful bit, gets shorter and the probability of a post-stroke hold gets less likely. So it's almost as if they haven't fully inhibited their gestures when they're lying, if they are doing gestures, then they may give the game away through gesture-speech mismatches or by this interesting phases of the gesture start to change. So what I'm saying is that body language is amazingly interesting. It holds the key to so much of social interaction and social life. A lot of what's out there, though, is just, from my point of view, a little bit crude. It's based upon static positions, slow behaviours. It doesn't recognise the speed and dynamic aspects of body language. It doesn't recognise the connection between speech. And incredibly, it doesn't recognise that so much of body language is actually about aspects of our thinking. It seems to suggest it's all about emotions and about interpersonal relationships, but there's this additional function, which is when people are thinking and speaking, so much of what they're thinking is in their hand movements, and these hand movements can really tell us a great deal. So this is something which is my kind of passion. I've been doing a lot of academic work on it over the years. And more recently I've done something which is a little bit different. I've written a novel about a body language expert. Forthcoming, it's called The Body's Little Secrets. And I thought it would be really interesting to explore in a novel form, in a fictional form, put a body language expert as the narrator and the protagonist in the story, just to imagine how he might use this knowledge to good or bad psychological effects. And I've situated the whole story in the north of England during a time of change, industrial change, when people were a lot of unemployment. So I've tried to put in a situation of some gravity, of some grittiness. And I should say that after I left Cambridge, my first academic job was in Sheffield, so I got a chance to observe the north pretty close up during that period of time, and was fascinated and upset, as most people were, seeing what was happening to people's lives as a result of various government policies. So I put the body language expert in there, kind of observing the lives around him, observing people still trying to be something when everything had been taken away from them. And I haven't given the body language expert superpowers or anything, so he's very much trying to make his way in this location like everyone else. So if anyone's interested, then you can look out for the novel, which is coming out next month, published by Gibson Square. So this is a fascinating topic. As I say, there's much more to body language than many of these books would have us believe. But if you want, good relationships, if you want to interact with people more successfully, if you want to understand people more, I think you have to have a more sophisticated take on body language. You have to learn to look for the right signals. When I started doing the work on hand movements, one of the first studies I did was compared people's accuracy in terms of being able to read people. And what I found absolutely fascinating was that some people could pick up the smallest little signals from the hands, and other people, when I asked them what they'd read from the hands, what they'd decoded, they hadn't even spotted that the hands were moving. And to me, this is a really interesting aspect of social life. I mean, we talk about emotional intelligence and people's ability to read other people, but what's really interesting is that perhaps when it comes to emotional intelligence, we need to rethink aspects of it to make it more dynamic, to measure people's ability to spot small signals and small cues in the hand. So that's one aspect of it. And interestingly, I did some work quite recently, eye tracking people in social interaction to see where they look. And again, what's really interesting is that some people look for the right bits of the body to pick up the signals from informative bits, and other people kind of focus on other bits which perhaps are giving them less information, even though they think they're getting all of the information they need to kind of understand people. So I'm really interested in this notion of giving people more information about how they can read people. I'm interested in giving people more information about how they can do it accurately, what to look out for. Because I think when it comes to body language and non-verbal communication generally, I think as an academic psychologist, what strikes me more than anything is how many myths and false assumptions are out there. I mean, it's part of our common everyday understanding that 93% of communication is non-verbal. It's an extraordinary claim. I mean, as someone who studies it for a living, I can tell you it's incredibly powerful. Can you say it's 93% of communication? Definitely not, because the studies on which that claim's based are quite weak studies, small numbers of senders, very deliberate posed communications. And part of what I do is kind of investigate in different situations with different channels of communication exactly what it does and kind of how powerful it is. So that's one of those kind of myths. And another myth, as I've said a number of times now, is that body language is really slow and easy to recognize. So you can show people pictures and say this means this. But the problem, of course, with human beings is they're dynamic. They're always interacting, talking, moving. And of course, one phenomenon that everyone looks out for is what's called postural congruence or postural echo, when people display identical postures. But what happens if it's echo 1 second and it's changed the next, etc., etc. So you need to learn to integrate information, look out for these dynamic cues, and be more sensitive to the right informative aspects of communication. Okay, so again, let me say that a difficult talk to do without all of this stuff, all the slides. So again, I'll mention that next Tuesday, the 1st of May, I'm talking at BBB Shoreditch. And the title of the talk is Revealing the Secrets of Body Language. Not surprisingly, given my kind of academic background, I'm often asked to analyse politicians because politicians, of course, are excellent these days at sending a message, through their speech and through their body language. And part of what I'm asked to do is, can I see through the mask and pick out bits that other people haven't noticed? And I had a little slot on News at 10, one general election called The Body Politic, where I analysed politicians. And of course, in the last few years and months, Donald Trump, I'm afraid, comes in for some analysis from me, because he has some very, very distinctive non-verbal behaviours. So that's another thing that I do. So if you're interested, please come along. I'm an academic psychologist, passionate at getting people generally involved in understanding psychology. Huge fan of Psychologies magazine, because the mission of Psychologies magazine is to get the public excited about psychological knowledge. And I think that it can change your life. But as I say, in the novel I explore the life of one particular body language expert. And what I have to do now is to say that Psychology's Life Leap Club is an online coaching club for all of our subscribers, where you'll be supported and inspired by top coaches, experts and psychologists, to help you create the life you really want. And I really like that, create the life you really want. You can use psychology effectively for that. To find out more, sign up to Psychology's newsletter at psychologies.co.uk. And as I say, if you're interested in the stuff that I've been talking about, please have a look at geoffbeattie.com and see the academic research, see the books, and hopefully I'll see some of you next Tuesday night in Shoreditch. Okay, thank you.